And welcome back to BizMafia. We are delighted to interview John Hewitt, entrepreneur, author, and most notably, founder of Jackson Hewitt and Liberty Tax Service. Together, these companies account for more than 10,000 tax preparation offices in the United States and Canada. John also founded Loyalty Brands, which we're going to dive into as well, because that's a big part of the story here. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Being an entrepreneur really requires a combination of passion, determination, creativity, and the ability to navigate risk, really. If we look at your life like a book, and by the way, a little plug for you, John does have a book, I Compete, How My Extraordinary Strategy for Winning Can Be Yours. So if we look at your life like a book, it would cover all of those areas. But if we go back to the very beginning, when you first joined H&R Block and eventually became the youngest regional director, at what point did that entrepreneurial bug bite you versus, staying content with a corporate role, as many people would do?
Actually, I've been with H&R Block 12 years, and I was running 250 locations, and that would have been my dream for about 11 years. I wanted to be an H&R Block regional director. And so by the time I was 31, I made my dream come true. And so I was happy. And my dad was the CFO of a public company. He liked the little Apple he bought by mail better than the mainframe that was running his public company. And he had always wanted to be an entrepreneur. He had 5 children very quickly and had lost both his parents and had to fight for our livings. And so he never got a chance. So he always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And he said, let's computerize taxes. So it took him about 6 months to convince me. As I said, I was happy as a regional director at H&R Block. And he said, let's computerize taxes. So we both quit our jobs. And in 1981, we built the first tax software for an Apple computer.
That's fantastic. Pat, did you want to jump in a question there?
Yeah, John. So it's interesting because I believe one of the things I saw in another podcast is that you approached H&R Block and they said something like, hey, computers will never be part of taxes, right? So tell us a little bit about your vision, why you saw computers and software changing things. That's probably a mistake on H&R Block's part. They didn't have the vision, you did. Let's get into that.
Well, it's more than probably a mistake. They made a big mistake, big mistake. When I started competing against them, as a result of them not buying my software, I started competing against them. And they had 9,000 offices when I started competing. And I built 2 companies with 10,000 offices, and they still had 9,000. So they didn't grow at all. And my 2 companies grew to 10,000. So it was a big mistake. What they said is in their annual report, public company, Fortune 500 company, in their annual report in 1983, they wrote, people ask us why we don't computerize. We say, why should we? Doesn't save us any money. Customers don't care. We are never going to computerize. That's how they represented the world back then. People were afraid of computers. They didn't understand computers. There was no such thing as there was just barely 50,000 Apple computers in the country. Now there's hundreds of millions, right? So It was a different world back then, and they were totally blind to the future.
What did you see? What went through John Hewitt's head that you saw this path, this revolution?
What happens in our industry is there are a lot of errors made, not an error of commission, but an error of omission, that we just don't ask the customer the right questions. So for example, when you have charitable deductions, not only can you take cash, but if you have volunteer, you can take mileage. If you give clothes or furniture or automobiles, you can take a deduction. And so most people don't know what's deductible, and most preparers don't care to ask enough questions to dig for deductions. And so what we did is we built a decision tree software that if you had medical expenses, it asked you about mileage back and forth to the doctor and the dentist and the hospital. If you had charitable contributions, it asked you about property or clothing or donating or being an officer of a charitable organization and mileage. If you had rental property, not only the normal deductions, but special, unusual deductions like, again, travel back and forth. And so it made every preparer an expert. It changed an average tax preparer into an expert each and every time because the interview was done by the computer. It was decision tree. If you didn't have a rental property, it didn't ask you any questions. If you didn't say you had charitable deductions, it didn't dig into charitable deductions. And so it was a world-class quality service we were providing to the customer.
So, John, that was back in the 80s. I mean, today, if you have a concept or an idea, there's a number of contractors and folks that you can reach out to help you take a conceptual idea and put it into reality. Back in the 80s, when you came up with this idea, where did you turn to try and take it from concept to, something that was tangible?
Well, fortunately, Apple computers had BASIC. You could program in BASIC. You didn't need C++ or any of the Fortran or any of the languages you learned in college. It was very simple. To me, it was like geometry, and I loved geometry in class. It was very step by step. If this, then this. If this, then this. And so I learned. I built it myself. And then once computers became more sophisticated, then we hired programmers to begin putting in a more sophisticated languages. And so over the years, the software that I developed in 1981 has changed languages at least 5 or 6 times. But it was fortunate I was able to do it in basic, very simple, logical format.
And so at that point, and again, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but at some point you have this idea, it's something you passionately believe in, and you launch Jackson Hewitt. Now, before the launch, I'm sure you're putting together the funds and collecting the appropriate investors that believe in this idea. Did you stay local? Did you go outside of your area to find these investors? Tell us a little bit about the investors that you ultimately found and then how you launched and started to acquire these 6 offices as mentioned.
Yeah, we built our software 1981, ready to go, and no one wanted it. H&R Block didn't want it. We couldn't find a way to monetize it. And so I got lucky and found a tax service here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, called Mel Jackson Tax Service. I saw it advertised in the Wall Street Journal. And we bought Mel Jack's 6 offices from his widow in August of 1982. And to buy it, we merged the 2 companies, merged the software company and the tax company. We went out and went to friends and family, and we raised $129,000. Well, for every $1,000 you invested in 1982, 15 years later, that was worth $200,000. So
Wow.
that
Wow.
120, we sold the company 15 years later for $483 million. So I was very humbled. I went to one of we call them the 12 disciples. Went to 12, and half of them were friends, and then the rest were friends of friends. And friends are ex-employees or ex-employees. So we went to our circle, and then some of them brought in others. But it was always a friend or a friend of a friend. We didn't have any unknown people that joined our organization.
Wow. And so that was back early 80s, so 1982. And at some point, the IRS looks at revising or transitioning to electronic filing process sorts. Was that like adding this fuel to the fire to help it burn even more with the introduction of that process?
Well, what happened is it was so important to the industry that H&R Block threw up their hands when they started in 1986. H&R Block had said, no, we're never going to do it. We're never going to do it. They jumped in and said, we better do it. We need to get on the bandwagon. And so we were already doing all of our returns on computer. H&R Block was doing 0 returns on computer. So we had a huge head start. So what initially propelled Jackson Hewitt into becoming a huge organization, today they have 6,000 offices, to H&R Block's 9,000. So when I started competing against H&R Block, I had 6 offices at Mel Jackson, and Block had 9,000. Well, 20 years later, Jackson Hewitt had 6,000 and Block still had 9,000. So it went from 6 to 6,000. And part of that was we embraced computerization and electronic filing, and Block fought it tooth and nail.
So, John, one of the things that I find fascinating that we get into a lot in this is so you go from this kind of mom and pop, father son thing, you have this vision. Talk about the scale of that. It's kind of incredible to go to those kind of numbers. What does that part look like? Because there's the idea, then there's the implementation. You successfully executed at a rapid rate.
Yeah, it's growing is very chaotic. Incredible fast growth is chaotic. You can't grow without chaos because the people that lead you when you have 6 offices are different than the leaders when you have 600, that are different than you have 3,000, then you have 6,000. You have to continually change, either get incredibly lucky and have someone that's really good and can transition and manage a huge company and a small company, or you have to continually change your people out as the company exceeds their capabilities. And so that's a difficult process that you have to, as you go through different CFOs, go for different CMOs, different CIOs as you grow. Both of my companies were public companies. You can't afford a public company CFO 250,000 a year plus bonuses plus stock when you have 6 offices, right? And your total revenue is 150,000, right? I mean, so you have to, transitioning people is incredibly important. Processes. The number one most difficult thing that I found in each of my journeys, and I'm on my third journey now, and each of the journeys, it's tough managing the income and the structure. You can't have too much income without structure, or you don't offer great service. And you can't have too much structure without income, or you go bankrupt. So knowing when to hire, and when we started franchising at Jackson Hewitt, we had 3 employees. When we built to a $483 million company, which became a $1 billion company, it had 500 employees. So the transition was enormous to go from 3 to 500 employees in both companies.
Also, so explain to us when you get into the idea of franchising, John, you're an expert at this. I think you're like the only guy in the country that's created, what is it, in excess of 5,000 franchises twice you've done, right? Something to that effect. What is the business model around that versus why not just become this huge institution, for example? What's the benefit of franchising? That's something that you're familiar with. You're an expert at it. What's that look like?
Yeah, if you read my book, the second biggest mistake that I ever made when I started Jackson Hewitt was that I didn't franchise immediately. When we acquired Mel Jackson in 1982, we told each of our dozen investors, we're going to be number one. We're going to be bigger than Block. Now, Block had 9,000 and we had 6, not 6,000, 6. So by the first year in August, we had 6. In January, we had 11. In the following January, we had 15. In the following January, we had 22. So to grow from 6 to 11 to 15 to 22 in 2.5 years, that's not bad. That's pretty good growth. But meantime, Block had 9,000, 9,000, 9,000. And I realized I was going to be about 9,000 years old by the time I got to 9,000 offices. So I better do something different. And so we were all company owned. And so that was the second biggest mistake I ever made. And we immediately switched to franchise. And we went from 22 to 49 to 200 to 400 to 600. We began growing exponentially because a franchisee brings 2 things to the table. They bring money and they bring their time. In a way, and you'll never hear anyone say this, I don't think, in franchising, but when you're a franchisee, you pay me to work for me. And so I get some great people that are trying to seize the American dream. And indeed, they have. I've created 1,000 million. There's people that are typically, my favorite people are people that are worth less than 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 that seize the American dream. I love them a lot better than someone that's worth 5 million that wants to make another million, right? I love the people that I change their lives. And so you get that spirit and that hard work and that ethic and they're all in. That's the real skin in the game isn't your money. People think it's money, but the skin in the game is you're all in.
How do you decipher that when you're, because you can have franchisees that don't meet the commitments, are not going to follow your direction. You've got processes, you have standards. How do
Yeah,
you decide this person's going to work? They're not going to work. What's that look like?
you're exactly right. I've brought in 5,200 franchisees. And as I said, about 1,000 became millionaires, but 1,000 went out of business.
Right.
And so the key, and you're right about the processes and the system that we produce. My job as a franchisor is to give you the best system in the universe, better than anyone in the industry. I've been doing that for 54 years. And your job then, if I do my job, then your job is to follow that system. Now, you would think that's automatic. Probably, I don't know you two that very well, but I assume you're not experts at running income tax offices. And I've been doing it for 54 years, the most experienced person ever. So if I say to be open at 7 a.m. on February 3rd, why would you open at 9 a.m. or 6 a.m.? I mean, follow the yellow brick road, follow the program. And you would think that would be easy and automatic. In fact, you have to pay me to follow my system. You can not pay me anything if you're not going to listen. Well, out of the 5,200 franchisees I brought in, not one has ever listened. Zero, zippity doo-dah. No one listens. And I can only tell you that's human nature. If you have children, you understand that because they don't listen. But even if you don't have children, you've been children and you didn't listen to your parents, and either did I. Human have to learn by making mistakes, but we beg you and beseech you to don't make the same mistakes. There isn't a mistake I haven't made or seen. What a great franchise system is, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, do this. This is proven. This is proven. And so of my 5,200 franchises told me, I'm gonna be the first person to listen. I'm gonna be the first one, John. I love systems. I'm gonna be the first one. And I just said, I learned to say, yeah, right. You're not gonna listen. Right. So everyone says they're gonna listen. So we have a couple steps. Number one is we don't allow you to become a franchise until you attend training. Most franchise systems, you just sign up and then go to training. And you get your franchise before. We don't allow you to complete and become a franchise until you finish training. Because if I see that you're not going to listen, we get rid of you, right? Because when a franchisee fails, they can blame themselves or me. And they always blame me first, right? So
Sure.
there's no joy in that. And then we monitor very closely. In our business, we know how many returns you're supposed to do each day during the tax season. So we know how many returns you're going to do on January 17th, 18th, 19th. And we don't wait until April 15th to evaluate you. We're watching from day one. And so if you're not meeting your goals, first you get an email, second you get a phone call, and third you get a visit and saying, Pat, you're just not listening. I mean, you either need to start listening or you're going to fail. And so we're monitoring every step of the way. And in fact, we have conference calls twice a week saying, this is what you're supposed to do today. So we're giving continual guidance. We're continuing to take the pulse of each franchise and guide them and say, you're not listening. But again, we will always have people that tell us they're going to listen. They may even think they're going to listen, but they don't.
You're operating two businesses at this point, if you think about it. It's Jackson Hewitt and then the franchise aspect of this. And at the time, again, I don't think there were many operating manuals available, right? To essentially copy and paste for how to run a successful franchise. So it's interesting that you almost have two businesses living within one, because now you have the franchise model. And now talk to us a little bit more of how are you developing these strategies? I mean, obviously you're learning from those franchisees who aren't listening, but are you taking the notes and then saying, all right, to make sure that we are being clear on what we're expecting, you're doing this on the fly? I mean, tell us, how do you eventually develop what is today's kind of operating manual for franchisees?
In every franchise system, not only do the franchisees work harder than company employees, and as a result, do better, whether it's McDonald's or Subways or Holiday Inn or ATAX or Liberty Tax, the franchisees work harder and do better. Now, they also come up with almost all the creativity. So, for example, at McDonald's, when McDonald's started 60 years ago, they only had one size drink. Then some franchisees said, well, why don't we have large and small? And then another franchisee said, why don't we have large, medium, and small? And then someone invented the Big Mac, and one of the franchisees invented breakfast, and one of them invented. So you have to listen. You have to listen to the franchisees. There are certain basics that you need to do, like the hours of operation and the fees that we charge and so forth. But the franchisees have all the creativity, and they deal with the customers. Most companies fail because they don't listen well to the customer. So what we did is during every convention, once a year, we break into groups and say, tell us how to improve our marketing. Tell us how to improve our software. Tell us how to improve. And we break into groups and we write every idea down, every idea from every franchise, no matter how stupid it is, right? It could be the smartest idea ever, the stupidest idea ever. And then after the convention, we have a meeting with the executives of our company and representatives of franchise systems, and then say, what are we going to change this year? What are we going to change sometime in the future? And what are we never going to change? And then I'm proud to say that over 50% of the ideas are implemented the next year by the next tax season. So we have it immediately after the tax season. So we have 7 months to get ready, 7 or 8 months to get ready for the next tax season. So we listen to our franchisees give us advice. And we never roll out anything that isn't tested and proven, right? So I learned a long time ago, you never test anything on a national basis. So let's say someone has an idea and they say, instead of charging based on the complexity of a tax return, let's charge everyone $100. And so we'll try that. So we'll pick one city to try that in, or 5 offices. There's a city with 10 offices. We'll do it in 5 offices and test it in against the other 5 offices. Or during April 14th and 15th, let's be open 24 hours. And so we'll test that. And so we listen to our franchisees. When I left both of my companies, both Jackson Hewitt and Liberty, they immediately canceled that listening at convention and said, no, we're supposed to know the business. Now, none of the people knew anything about taxes. Since I left Jackson Hewitt, there's been 12 different CEOs since I left, and 12 at Block at the same time. Since I left Liberty 5 years ago, there's been 5 CEOs. None of them had tax experience. And yet they don't listen to the franchise. They lecture to them. Because we're supposed to know. Well, I've been doing this 54 years and I still listen to my people because I know the big picture better than any human being in this industry. But they know what they have the pulse of the customer, and they know what their customer in their neighborhood wants. And so they need to know the tools that they need, that I need to provide them, because it's not a in a way, it's people think of national as a generic, but you lose when you go generic. You lose when you go generic. You have to win neighborhood by neighborhood. And you can't be in a neighborhood of Chinese and treat them the same as you do Puerto Ricans. Even as, I mean, one of the reasons people fail at going after Hispanics is there's so many different types of Hispanics. There's Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Colombians and Mexicans, and everyone wants to treat everyone the same. And national companies try to do that to simplify their rules and their procedures. But that's not a winning strategy. It's a market by market, neighborhood by neighborhood strategy that we've employed.
I really like that winning strategy. It sounds basic, but it's really not, because Pat and I have both seen in a number of industries when these businesses stop listening to the consumer and their clients. And that's where they get into trouble, where they think that, they've grown considerably, but then all of a sudden they think they're the smartest person in the room. I like the fact that you are extremely experienced, well versed in your craft, but yet you continue to this day to listen to your customers, and even you can add franchisees to that mix as a part of customer base.
So I just want to make a comment I find really interesting, John. So I read a book recently about Michael Jordan and all of his coaches going back, this incredible talent and all that. But what really set him apart was he was a great listener. And even his college coach and his pro coaches said they'd never seen an individual who listened to the same extent that he did. And I can hear a lot of that in what you're saying. And we think it's really cool, the grassroots sort of listening skills that you implemented. Shifting to that in terms of, you mentioned Jackson Hewitt's had 12 CEOs and individuals that don't have tax expertise. You've had some high level investors. You've had sort of some known acrimony with them. And there's always, I think, a tension between founders and then that institutional money. Your experience and insight on what to look for in terms of how that will or won't work would be, I think, helpful for the audience if you can take us through that.
In looking for investors?
Well,
And
not in considering investors and the partnerships that are going to work, because just because somebody writes a big check, to your point, doesn't guarantee success. They may be too corporate. They may not have any tax expertise they may not listen. But to grow, having that capital behind you is helpful, but there's a balance there.
To make it clear, the only guy that's founded 2 of the top 100 retail chains in the country. Both of them public companies, both became worth $500 million. If you invested in me, you made, extraordinary exponential growth, both companies. So if you look at those 2 companies, well, I was with Jackson Hewitt from 82, and I sold out of Liberty in 2018. So in 36 years, I had 2 fights with my investors. So, for example, at Jackson Hewitt, we went 14 years, 100% unanimous, every vote, every director vote, it was all good. And then the IRS, they almost ruined the industry in 1995. And in fact, H&R Block, who had been a public company from 91 forward, and when you're franchising, you have to publish your financials. They never lost more than $1 million worse than the year before, right? They always either grew or had $1 million. That year, they had $100 million loss from the previous year. They decimated the industry. In fact, Beneficial Finance, which was making loans to customers, sued the IRS. So it turned out okay. The industry jumped back, but my investor went crazy. And so big fight. And so as a result, I left Jackson Hewitt. Now, fast forward, then I started Liberty, and that company went 20 years without a fight. So, unanimous board meetings, everything's great. And then the industry changed, and the private equity got antsy. And so another big fight. So in 36 years, I had 2 fights, right? Even though with both companies, I made them a ton of money, right? They forget about what you did yesterday. And when a venture capital 101, private equity 101, is when a company's being built. If it stops growing fast, you change out the founder. That's just 101. And what I really learned, and I would caution everyone that's taking venture capital, is that when you first start, when they invest the dollars in, everyone has a 5-year horizon. And I'm always as an entrepreneur, as a very successful entrepreneur, I'm always thinking long term, right? I'm not thinking 5 weeks from now or 5 months from now. I'm thinking 5, 10 years from now. How am I going to build this to a great organization? So when you start, you have a 5-year horizon. Well, after 1 year, I still have a 5 to 10 year horizon, and they have a 4-year horizon. And after 2 years, I still have a 5 to 10, and now they have a 3-year horizon. So it begins to press upon them to monetize their investment. And they're much more concerned. And as years go by, they're much more concerned about the quarter than what's going to happen 5 years from now. They're not in it for life. When I start a company, just like a Michael Jordan, right, I'm in it for life, right? I'm all in, and they're not. And so the thing that I would caution everyone about venture capital and private equity, there's a place for them, but understand that as time passes, they're going to want to cash out, and they're going to want you to put the company in a position to be very sellable. which means you need a good year. So even if let's say that, for example, and this isn't true, but let's say that their time frame was exactly 5 years. They wanted to sell exactly, because they're usually more flexible than that. It might be 3 to 8, but 5 is about the right number. But let's say it was 5. That fifth year, they want you to artificially build up that P&L so that you get the highest amount for their shares. So they don't really care about what happens in the 6th year. They care about what happens in the 5th year. So the objectives of both parties are different as you approach maturity of their investment.
Yeah, I think that's something that these public companies also have to deal with, right? Is this instant gratification, these short-term results versus, at risk of the long-term vision. To your point, how do you, right? Because and this is great advice for these entrepreneurs, that as you're looking at investors of any type, making sure you understand what their goals are versus your goals in the long-term strategy. And also, a lot of people can get deterred by the check that's being written, to Pat's point. As you were learning these things along the journey, how did you apply it to the next company and the next company? Did you look to take less investments from PE and venture, for example, or even outside investors, and just focus on the franchise aspect? What ultimately did you do with that knowledge?
Well, after the first time, after my Civil War at Jackson Hewitt, I said, from now on, I'm going to have controlling shares. And so at Liberty Tax, I had, even a public company, I had controlling shares. So I got to vote for one more director than they did, all the other shareholders combined. So my change was that I was going to have controlling shares. When I started Loyalty Brands, one more change. Not only am I going to have controlling shares, but I'm never going public again. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley really, really changed the way that the fighting was when we fought. After 20 years, we had a civil war, and they eviscerated me in public.
I was going to say that Sarbanes-Oxley, this being a public company CEO just seems like a nightmare to me. I've got to imagine every single decision is dictated by some regulation. Is that sort of what it's like up close and personal?
Exactly. And for example, they set up a audit committee of the board that doesn't have to listen to you. It doesn't have to listen to the shareholders or the CEO. So it's like out of my control. And they get to run rampage. They get to run rampant and do whatever they want and cause difficulties for everyone else. And they are all the independent directors. They're not. And so some of them have very little stock and very little, care about the company. I mean, you get your venture capitalists, but you need independent directors that have almost no stock, that are running during a fight, during a tiff, can be very instrumental, and they don't have any skin in the game. They don't really care. I owned, the company's a $500 million company. I owned $100 million worth of stock, and they didn't own $100,000 worth of stock. And so they're getting to tell me what to do and argue on the behalf of whatever they believe. And I represented the stockholders and the franchisees. At the peak, we had 2,000 franchisees. And I represented the franchisees and the stockholders. They didn't care. So the rules and regulations are just not reasonable. And it forces you to do things that aren't in the best interest of shareholders. And it's very expensive. I mean, even though we were, just a $500 million company, it cost us $5 million a year just to follow Sarbanes-Oxley and be a public company. So, our EBITDA was only like $50 million, and that's after spending $5 million a year just adhering to all this Sarbanes-Oxley rules.
So, John, despite all these challenges, what kept you going? I mean, to a common person, this might set them back, where after their second venture, successful venture that is, they say, enough's enough, I'm done, I'm taking a break. That wasn't the course that you followed. Why?
Right. Well, you're right. And I'm old. I just turned 74 last week. And, most people are long retired by the time you're my age. And I think I don't begrudge anyone for being retired if that's what you want. But I believe whom much is given, much is expected. And the peak of my knowledge and experience is right now. And to go sit on a beach somewhere or on a golf course and just play tiddlywinks, or even things like I love chess and bridge. I'm a life master chess player and bridge player. I'm just wasting what I've learned for 54 years. And the number one thing that's driven me forever is changing people's lives. And I brought in 5,000 franchisees. And as I said, over 1,000 millionaires. They've had hundreds of thousands of employees. And then we've done over 100 million tax returns. I've changed a lot of lives. And that's what drives me is to give back. That's what keeps me going every minute, is changing lives and making the world a better place.
John, listening to some of your other podcasts and just based on, I think, Brian and my own personal business experience, and the Michael Jordan one is a great example. The word drive, okay? You are incredibly driven, and I think life-changing, successful entrepreneurs are highly driven. We live in a culture where I think everybody works hard to a degree, right? It's out there. I work so hard. I work this. But I think that there's really, in the scheme of it, not a ton of driven people in the grand scheme of things. Talk to us about, in your view, how drive is different from the everyday motivation, because you have that. And the best of the best typically do. Let us inside your head a little bit there.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great and I'm trying to do this, but it's almost impossible. Wouldn't it be great if you could identify in your employees those that think like owners, that are driven and act like owners? I mean, in my experience, in all the thousands and thousands of employees I've had, you can only find maybe 2% that act like owners. Most employees act like employees. In my franchises, over 95% act like owners, because 100% of them are owners, but not everyone acts like an owner, but 95%. So wouldn't it be great if you could, when you're interviewing, you could find that person, you could identify before they ever set foot in the door and hire them? Well, one of the things that I've been blessed with is, and that's why we call the company Loyalty Brands. I have so many people loyal to me. I have one guy's been with me 53 years. I have four that have been with me 30, seven that have been with me 25, lots have been with me 20. And so when you find that person, the key is, when you find that person, is sticking with them and nurturing them and helping them. And the only way to get loyalty is to give loyalty. It starts by giving loyalty. And what I realized in 1988, I realized the difference between why Walmart is Walmart and Kmart is Kmart. I mean, do either of you believe that Walmart has some secret sauce that is hard to see, that it's hard to understand? Do they have a Coca-Cola formula or anything? No, it's obvious. What they
No.
do is, why is Kmart fail? And I said, so if I looked at and I realized in 1988 for the first time, if I looked at the top executives at Walmart and the top executives of Kmart, are the Walmart executives more experienced? Are they smarter? Are they more educated? I said, no, you can hire the smartest, most educated, and most experienced. What the difference is, culture and the way you treat people. And culture is an asset that in this world, I don't see too many people understanding that it should be on the balance sheet. Almost, right? You have your equipment and your buildings and your software and all that on your balance sheet. But culture should be on your balance sheet, because it's that important, especially in a franchise organization where all of your partners are independent. They're not employees. So culture is incredibly even more important in there. But the difference between Walmart and Kmart, simply in my mind, of the people that run it. The difference is in the culture of the organization.
So, John, on that front, you said that you had very few employees that treated it like a business, or ownership, rather. I'm sure that you see much more of that in your franchisees, because to your point, they kind of are owners, and I'm sure there were plenty that didn't really know what they were getting into and then failed. that's a hard thing to do to get the ownership mentality if somebody's not an owner. But I know that's something that you're kind of working on in your current business. And in your illustrious career and decades of experience, how do you try to get that? And how do you identify it getting employees who are going to have the ownership mentality?
Yeah, again, it's almost impossible. And so, and I've spent 54 years working on it and not solved that problem yet. So today, if I go hire 50 employees, only one or two are going to have that ownership mentality. So part
Why
of
do you
that,
think that is, John? Do you think that's our culture now? What I mean, there's plenty of people that become owners. I think they treat their job as if they're an owner and eventually they become an owner. What do you see in our society that's not readily obvious?
I find Americans to be ingrates, even with my own children. I have 6 children, 11 grandchildren, and now I didn't feel old until I have 3 great grandchildren. But even in my 6 children, I have not been able to teach them to be grateful. And in my opinion, to be alive and healthy and live in the United States of America, you're already in the top 1% of human beings on the planet. And tell me one American that you run into each day that feels like they're in the top 1%. My children are, I mean, people whine and complain, and, the traffic is bad, the food is bad, the service is bad, this is bad. And I find Americans to be highly unappreciative of what they've been given. And so it starts with God. And then part of being godly is being grateful, just understanding what your blessings. And Americans do not understand their blessings. And, my oldest daughter is 56 years old. I can't convince her. I mean, my children, I cannot convince them to how blessed they are. I think that's a sickness in America, if not in of the human race.
That does tie in to your earlier comments about showing loyalty first to those employees that you believe in, and then they're loyal to you. It is interesting too, if you think of it from a business perspective, how many organizations will have these loyal individuals and essentially treat them like a number or a cog in the machine and push them to the side. And you have taken people along this journey with you that you believe in, because it's a needed commodity, essentially. How many of your leaders have they transitioned? Give us a sense of, with each chapter, are they following you to the next adventure, or are you starting from scratch?
Yeah, when I started Jackson Hewitt, I only took my ex-wife, and she had worked with me at Block for the last, let me see how many years I've been with Block, when she had about last 7 years. So she had worked 7 years with me at H&R Block. And we were the only person I took with me from Block is my ex-wife. When I started Jackson Hewitt, when I started Liberty Tax, I took my top 4 people with me from Jackson Hewitt. And then one of the many blessings I've gotten is when my non-compete ended in the United States, I had a non-compete that lasted 3 years. And we started in Canada because Jackson Hewitt was almost totally saturated in the United States, but they weren't in Canada. So I took my top 4 people, and then the minute my non-compete ended, they laid off 100 people at headquarters of Jackson Hewitt and moved the company to Parsippany, New Jersey. Within minutes, I had dozens of people that had worked with me at Jackson Hewitt.
Wow.
They wanted to come anyway, most of them, but it's hard to leave something that where you've been for 15 or 20 or 25 years. And it's hard to leave, even if it's John Hewitt and who you're working for. You're comfortable. You think you have a job for life, and so I was just fortuitous. And over the first 5 to 7 years, I took at least 60 or 70 people from Jackson Hewitt into Liberty. And then loyalty started small. But as I said, I already have one guy's been with me for over 50 years. He was co-founder of Jackson Hewitt, a director. He's been with me 53 years. I have 4 30-year veterans. So some of my employees, the 30-year veterans, were both Jackson Hewitt and Liberty. And then the 25-year veterans were both. I guess, no, I started 25 years ago. So 25 or less is just Liberty. So even though we're small and only have 35 employees, half of them have have been with me from at least Liberty, and many of my franchisees are coming from either Liberty or Jackson Hewitt.
That's a good transition because now we're going from Liberty Tax Service to loyalty brands. It seems like with each new adventure and each new chapter, you have another great idea that you're chasing the ground here. Talk to us a little bit about the formation of loyalty brands, what the concept was there that you felt was unique and different, how it launched, and where it currently sits today.
As a CEO and you're required, if you're going to be a good CEO, you got to be a visionary. And so you got to envision a different way that the world is going to work than it is working today. And so I'm always been looking for that, for the differentiators. And so with Jackson Hewitt, it was computerization. With a Liberty, it was guerrilla marketing and the Statue of Liberty waiver. In the early years of Liberty Tax, for the first couple of years, people say, "Who's Liberty Tax? I never heard of it." And then pretty soon, within 3 or 4 years, people would say, "Oh, you're the one with the costume dancers out in front. You're the one with the Statue of Liberty dancing in front of your store."
That's
And
right.
so we were very famous and extraordinary at guerrilla marketing in many ways, including having the waiver in front of the location. But when we started Loyalty Brands, the couple of my best franchisees came to me and said, during the Civil War, a couple of my biggest, best franchisees came in and said, "You know what, let's start there's a Civil War going on. The franchisees are on your side. There are some of the venture capital are on the other side. And why don't we start a company called Loyalty that is for people that are loyal to John Hewitt?" And I added, so they came up with the name Loyalty. I added the name Brands because I love the concept of brand loyalty, loyalty brands. So that's why we called it Loyalty Brands. But we decided to do more than one industry for a couple of reasons. Number one is I had a non-compete in tax. And number two, I felt confident enough that myself and my team could run a company, a franchisor in another industry, as well as we had at tax. I was cocky enough to believe that. And no one's ever done a good job of cross marketing. No one's ever in any industry. I've never seen an industry where they do a good job of cross marketing. When we sold Jackson Hewitt, we sold it to a company called Send It. They had 35 good franchise systems, including Century 21, Caldwell Banker. They had Days Inn, they had Avis, and they had Jackson Hewitt. And yet they didn't do any cross marketing. So they didn't even go to the employees of the other brands and say, "Have your tax return done at Jackson Hewitt." They didn't go to the other brands and say, "Well, if you're going to rent a car, you need to rent it from Avis or we're not paying for it." They didn't even push the other two brands. So the cross marketing opportunity was very appealing. And there's been a trend over the last 10 or 15 years to have conglomerates of multi different franchise systems of 10, 12, 15, 50 or more. And so we just replicated that. So it mostly came about because I had never seen any company do a good job of cross marketing. And I had a non compete, so I didn't have anything to do in the tax business for a couple of years. So I said, "What are we going to do?" And right now, Zoom and Grooming, our mobile grooming service, is the hottest growing franchise system we have. And that's going to be, one of the things I love about other industries, the problem I've always had in the tax industry is this 900-pound gorilla, H&R Block, with 9,000 locations. In mobile grooming, for example, there's no 900-pound, there's no McDonald's, there's no H&R Block, there's no number one name, there's no name. So we'll be number one in the industry within 2 years, 2 more years. We're not even 2 years old. And in less than 4 years, we'll be a national name, the biggest in the industry. I never got a company the size of H&R Block. My two companies got to 10,000 offices. Block had 9,000, but Block still is the King Kong of the tax industry. And Zoom and Grooming, within a year and a half, is going to be King Kong in mobile dog grooming.
So, John, one of the things I think is part of your success, I see this a lot with entrepreneurs. everybody's got an idea. I think marketing that idea, packaging it, the Liberty tax is a great example because I remember that feature, the Statute of Liberty, and I hadn't thought of that for years. You obviously have marketing sense. Take us through that a little bit and how you compete in such a hyper competitive world. What is John Hewitt's perspective on marketing and how you package things different to make a dent when there's these other giants out there?
Yeah, that's a great point. That when you go up against a 900-pound gorilla or a household name, right? And like when Walmart had to go against Sears, and you guys aren't old enough to remember when Sears used to be an incredibly great company 50 years ago, 40 years, 5 years ago. And then along comes little Walmart. And they laughed at Walmart for the first year or two. They had, that used to be called Walton Five and Dime. They laughed at them, and then so what I learned is that it's the David and Goliath story. If David had gone onto the field against Goliath and had the same sword and shield and armor as Goliath, there wouldn't be a David and Goliath story. He'd be the 187th guy killed by Goliath.
Right.
So you have to have differentiators. And so we start with each brand working on differentiators. What are you going to do different? If pretend TV advertising worked, and maybe it did 40 or 50 years ago, it certainly doesn't today. If that is all my franchisees and every brand wants national advertising, right? If national advertising worked, then whoever had the most money would win. So you'd be glad that there are other differentiators. I mean, at one point, I heard a couple of years ago, Tesla had a bigger market cap than Ford, General Motors, Toyota, Honda, like 5 times more than all of them combined. And I remember a time when there was just the big three, and then along came Japan and Toyota, and that revolutionized it. So you had to have something different. And historically, in the 60s, the Americans had big cars. So the differentiator was the Volkswagen with a little car, the little Toyotas with the little cars that set them apart. You need your differentiator. Pepsi and Coke at one time, about 80 years ago, Pepsi had about a market share of about 10%, and Coke had 85%, and there was RC Cola and a few. And Pepsi got this great idea that it used to be back then, every Coke was a nickel, and in the little green bottles. So I think it was 8 ounces. So Pepsi had a campaign that said, okay, so Coke was a nickel a bottle, and they came out with 16-ounce bottles and said twice as much for your money. And so Pepsi began to grab market share like crazy, right? And I remember when Hertz started. Hertz had a great idea back in the 50s. In the 50s, you could only rent a car from a car dealer. So he flew into Los Angeles and he took a taxi into the city. He 20 miles away or 10 miles away to rent a car from a car dealer. He said, no, they should be closer to the airport. Well, if you read the book by Walter Avis, he flew into an airport and said, wait, there's a little space over there. Why don't I just put a kiosk inside the airport? That's his differentiator. You have to have differentiators. So in each of our brands, we have differentiators that we do better than everyone else. So in tax, I can give you a list of about 15 things that are objective that we do better than H&R Block or Jackson Hewitt or Liberty, that are objective differentiators.
How do you find your differentiator?
How do I find them?
Yeah.
Well, most of them we invent by listening to customers, and some of it is that I've invented based on my experience. One of the things that the costume character, right? The costume character. I didn't invent costume characters. If you're old enough, there was a silly faced Ronald McDonald 60 years ago, and there a little Wendy with the red hair, and Chick-fil-A has a cow. So I didn't invent it, but we just did it better. In 2000, when we started in the United States, you're bombarded with thousands of ads every day, whether it's online or now or in newspaper, radio, TV, whatever. So I asked people, if you drive to work, how many businesses do you pass? Most people say hundreds. How many can you name? Well, 20, 25. Well, if you saw a Lady Liberty waving at you every day, from January 1st to April 15th, would that make you one of the memorable businesses? And so such an easy way to grab market share. So we tested, tried, got all of our thousands of employees and franchisees and sometimes customers and said, tell us how to improve and tell us and listen to them. One idea I invented I didn't invent it until I got to Liberty. One was the waiver, but another one, when I was in my 20s, I had a tooth pull. And the dentist called me up himself. Like I'm sitting at home, 8 o'clock at night, and the dentist calls me up and says, how are you doing? I said, I mean, I was so flabbergasted and so impressed. So what we do is every company should do is we call our customers and say, how do we do for you? We're not only the only company in the industry that does that, we're the only company virtually of any industry that does that. That's a differentiator, calling up customers. And we've learned that the retention rate is significantly higher. The referral rate is higher because our taxpayers aren't good at asking for referrals. And either our dog groomers or our inspection guys for inspection boys or our roofers, they don't do a good job of asking for referrals. So you get a very personable person calls the customer, 95% of them are happy and say, please refer us to your friends. You have higher referrals, higher retention, and it's a differentiator. You need those differentiators.
That's great. You've taken, again, those lessons you've learned, your comments earlier, hey, I'm on top of my game, and you're definitely on top of your game. You're taking all those lessons and applying it, not just one niche within the franchise, but again, a part of the entire conglomerate of loyalty brand franchisees. How do you see this industry evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? What's going to look different?
I haven't, as an industry, I haven't put enough thought in that to give you a thoughtful answer on that about any significant changes. Obviously, the most significant change over the last few years and going forward is digital marketing. I mean, that's clearly so different. Back in the 80s and 90s, we would have bus cards and we would have snail mail and we would do some radio and we'd do some TV. So it's all about marketing and using all of the tools on the internet that you need to be where your customers are on the lookout for you. And so that's certainly the biggest change that I've seen over the last few years and going forward is staying on top of that. And there's almost no one that's really expert at that.
In some cases, you see old ideas that get recycled and they come back as new. I was telling the story a while ago about like sales process. It used to be 100% cold calling, picking up the phone, and then email came about, and email was the only game in town. And then email became so overplayed, and it just kept evolving. Do you see any kind of these? Have you identified or seen any old tactics that you think, hey, this is probably going to come back, and I'm going to get ahead of it? I mean, sounds basic, but customer service, I would say, was one of those areas. We got away from customer service and customer feedback and asking for referrals, and you're on top of that. Is there anything else that we might see kind of that was old that becomes new again?
Not off the top of my head.
John, I want to just jump back a little bit because a big part of our audience is folks that enjoy success stories, or maybe they're looking to break out of W-2, start their own thing. And it's such a hyper competitive world in business, I think in large part because of the digital marketing. And a lot of folks are just great marketers. Their service or product might be terrible, right? But you said something that I heard previously that really resonated with me, which is still in America, we have it better than 99% of the world. Risk really isn't all that great when you think about it in the scheme of things. I know when I went out on my own, I thought for forever, what if this doesn't work? And then I finally kind of came to the conclusion, hey, if I don't do this, I mean, I'm not going to be digging ditches in Pakistan or whatever, right? And I heard that from you on some other shows. Talk a little bit about that and what your advice might be to aspiring entrepreneurs about getting that mindset to going, hey, you really don't have anything to lose except not going for it.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk is in not doing anything. That my favorite story in the Bible is the talent story. That the first slave he buried 5 and doubled it. The second guy buried 2 and he doubled it. And the third guy, or he was given that by the master, and he went from 5 to 10, 2 to 4. The last guy just buried it under the ground and did nothing. And he said, "You're going down. Or you're get out of my sight. You're a horrible waste of humanity." And so I think the biggest risk is to do nothing. Everything is risky. Sitting in your house is risky. Going to the mall is risky. I mean, driving your car is. I mean, everything is risky. But the biggest failure is to not be all you can be, and to seize opportunities. And it's not always to be self-employed. And some people just don't have the stomach for it or the ability. I mean, 70% of the American public wants to be self-employed. Probably only 20 or 25% are capable of that. And some of it is just the risk tolerance. They have to have that weekly paycheck. So there are other ways to take risks besides being self-employed. But certainly you always want to be cognizant of opportunities and to be all you can be. My general philosophy is find something you love to do, work hard, persevere. And that doesn't matter whether you're self-employed or an employee.
That's great.
Great advice.
John, can you speak to any personal habits or routines that help you stay focused?
I think one of the reasons I have good vision is I'm a chess player. And so I started being really good when I was young. And so it helps me think about, okay, if they do that, I'm going to do this. And if, plan B, plan C. So I think chess playing has been an important guide for me in how I think about business and looking at envisioning the future.
That's great. As we look to wrap up, what's the last, piece of advice you would give to other aspiring entrepreneurs? You've given so many nuggets during this interview. I'm wondering if one or two stand out that you think are just a must for those who are aspiring to be in your shoes.
I think that our mission statement is, I love our mission statement, and everyone can steal it if they want. It started having fun, exceeding expectations. And so I think whatever you do, you have to have fun. If on Monday morning you're going to work and you're not looking forward to it, you're going to the wrong place. So fix your life. It's too short. Find something you love to do, and then you're never working. So first part is having fun. And then one of my favorite authors, Stan Phelps, wrote, he said, when you go to a party or a meeting, almost no one's never right on time. You're either early or late. No, if it's for at 2:00, it's either you're there before 2 or after 2. Almost no one's exactly at 2. And so in the same way with customers' expectations, you're never going to meet them. You're either going to exceed them or fail to meet them. And so our mission statement started as having fun, exceeding expectations. And then we changed it. And one of my people said, no, if we're going to exceed expectations, we're going to be improving lives. So our mission statement is simplistically 4 words: having fun, improving lives. And I think I would give that to every person, advice to every human being is have fun, improving lives.
That's great. Anything else you want to ask before we close up shop?
What are currently, John, what would you say the top 3 franchises out there today?
Besides mine?
Besides yours, of course.
I'm not in a position to say. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. My competitors spend a lot of time thinking about me. I'm just incredibly focused on winning. And so I don't spend a lot of time worrying about or thinking about other successful franchises, except if I see them doing something, then I do some research to see if I can learn anything from them. But I'm not the person to ask.
You're locked into what you're doing. So
my competitors.
Locked into what you're doing.
I'm laser focused on us.
Love it. Well, thanks a lot, John. This has really been great, and really appreciate you coming on to BizMafia.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, John.